Welcome everybody, and my name's Karuna. I'm the Director of Media and Social Media here at the ABS. Welcome to our presentation on CPI inflation and cost of living. This is actually our second in the series. We did an earlier sort of data literacy workshop, really more about our data tools like Table Builder, where to find data on our website. So if you go to our ABS YouTube channel, we also have a link to it in our week ahead media alert. Hi, Ricardo. Welcome. Just doing a brief intro. And first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri country on which we're coming to you from today in the ACT. And I actually live on Yuin country, and I'm so appreciative every time I go out to a special spot, the river or just in the bush, and really recognising the first Australians' continuing connection to the land and waters and community, and them looking after the land for tens of thousands of years. I pay my respect to them, their cultures and elders, and extend respect to all the traditional custodians of the lands that you're all on today. Also introducing Leigh Merrington, who's our acting head of price statistics, and he's going to talk to us today about the Consumer Price Index, very topical subject at the moment, how to read and use that index, how it measures inflation, and it's linked to the cost of living as well. At the end, Aidan's going to be moderate some questions after Leigh's presentation. You can also pop them in the chat as we go through, and we'll get to as many as we can. And if we can't get to it in time, we'll take that on notice as well. As Aidan mentioned, we will have a survey afterwards that we'll send around in a link, and I really appreciate your feedback so that these presentations are as useful to you as possible. Okay, thanks everybody, and I'll hand over to you, Leigh.
Thanks, Karuna. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. So thanks for coming along. I think with inflation and cost of living being such an important and big story over the past 18 months, we're well overdue for, I guess, a bit of an information session on the Consumer Price Index. So thanks to Karuna and the team for organising. So I'll just look to share my screen. Might just ask Karuna if you can see my screen okay.
Not yet.
Yeah, okay, let's go back. Oh, yeah. Should work now. How's that?
Yep. That's
all right. Great. Okay, so this session, I've split into three parts. So the first will cover a bit of a snapshot of the CPI, so the scope, the purpose of the CPI, and how the CPI is used. The second part will go through some of the main outputs of the CPI. So we produce a lot more than just the Consumer Price Index. And the third part is just a little bit of detail on how we measure the CPI. So we'll keep it quite simple, not too technical, but just some important things to keep in mind in terms of how the CPI is measured. So happy to take questions at the end, but also pause it along the way at the end of each part just to check in to see if there's any questions. Okay, so just starting with CPI in a nutshell. So what does the CPI cover? So it measures the change in prices of household spending. So this means it excludes things that are purchased for investment purposes. So things like any kind of asset, whether it's shares or an investment property, that is out of scope of the CPI. We are only interested in measuring household spending for consumption purposes. The CPI also only measures price change over time. It doesn't compare price levels. So you can't use the CPI to say Sydney is more expensive than Melbourne. You can use it to say the prices in Sydney have risen more quickly than in Melbourne, but we don't measure price levels in the CPI. The CPI covers around 70% of the population, so this is the 8 capital cities. We don't include regional areas, so to collect prices in those regional areas, has been too expensive in the past. We do have some new data sources which do cover those regional areas, but at this point in time, we focus on the capital cities. And a really important point is that the CPI measures average inflation for all households. So we don't target a particular household. For instance, a mum and dad and 2 kids, where we're looking at measuring inflation on average across all households. So every household has their own inflation experience, and the CPI looks to measure that experience across all households on average. Okay, so why do we have a CPI? So the ABS has been measuring price change for over 100 years, and the CPI in its current form goes back to 1948. So it's actually the 75th year of producing the CPI, and we've got some material coming out tomorrow with the monthly indicator, just to, I guess, to mark that milestone. So keep a lookout for that. Prior to the CPI, it was called the Retail Price Index, but just sort of shows that the ABS has been measuring price change in some form for over 100 years. Initially, in Australia and many countries, the CPI was produced to set wages, so to ensure that workers' purchasing power wasn't eroded by inflation, and the CPI was used directly to index or increase wages. In the late 90s, there was a major review of the CPI where it was changed from its main purpose being to set wages to the main purpose being a general measure of price inflation. So this, and a lot of countries did a similar thing, aligned it more closely to its use for monetary policy. So the CPI being used for inflation targeting, we changed the way we measure the CPI to a measure of inflation. Now that didn't lead to too many changes. The main one being housing, how housing is measured in the CPI, which I'll come back to later on. But it is something that housing is measured differently in the CPI in other countries. Not a lot of people realise that. In some countries, so in Europe, it's not actually included in their CPI housing. So I'll come back to how the ABS measures housing in the CPI. Just to go back to the point of inflation and price change being a subject that's been really important for a long period of time. Our first Australian statistician recognised this back in 1912, and when we established the Retail Price Index. So this was the predecessor to the CPI. Okay, so the CPI has many uses. I think it's the most visited statistic on the ABS website, and that does reflect how widely it is used. Its most important use, arguably, is for monetary policy. So the Reserve Bank of Australia has an inflation target of 2 to 3%, and what they do is they target annual inflation of 2 to 3% on average over time, so that the CPI itself doesn't have to be within that range at all periods. And as many of you would know, it's quite a bit above that range at the moment. But the RBA are looking to target inflation of 2 to 3% over time. One thing just to point out is that a lot of economists and journalists talk about the trim mean being the focus of the RBA. So that is true to an extent. But in terms of the inflation target, they're actually targeting the CPI, that 2 to 3% change over time. So just to showcase the importance of the CPI for monetary policy purposes. It's also used very widely for fiscal policy. So the CPI is linked directly to a number of government payments, things like JobSeeker and the age pension increase in line with the CPI. And even things like the alcohol excise, another example, that goes up by the CPI twice a year. So the CPI has a direct impact on many fiscal policy payments and taxation. And yeah, again, shows the importance of the CPI as a measure of inflation. It's also used very widely in either private contracts. So businesses may look to the CPI to determine how much to increase the goods and services they sell, or in fact how much to increase the wages that they pay. So the CPI is used to inform a lot of those decisions, and even things like contracts between landlords and tenants can be linked to the CPI. So the ABS doesn't endorse the use for these purposes, but we recognise it is used used very widely for these purposes. Another use of the CPI, which you may not be aware of, is deflation purposes. So this means for the GDP, gross domestic product, in order to produce real measures of GDP, you need to remove the price effect of the price effect on GDP to give you a volume measure. And to do that, we use the CPI amongst other measures of price change. So producer price index, another example. So the CPI is used as an input into producing measures for GDP. And finally, it's used very widely by economists and others just to understand the health of the economy. So used very widely for macroeconomic analysis. Okay, so just a little bit about the CPI. It's an index. So what is an index? The CPI, its reference period, so where it equals 100 is 2011-12 financial year. So it equals 100 over a 12-month period. There's no particular reason why we've chosen that period. You just need to pick a time period for the CPI to equal 100, and the index increases. Well, if inflation's going up, the index increases beyond that point, and prior to 11-12, it's lower than 100. We don't tend to update that time period very often. I think the previous time period was 1989, 1990, so something we might do kind of every 20 years. An index is also not a unit of measurement, so there's no you can't interpret an index like you can for, say, other statistics like the number of people employed or the amount of spending in dollar terms. The index is simply a mechanism to be able to show change over time. So just wanted to, I suppose, make the point that the index is in and of itself nothing particularly interesting, but how it measures change over time is what's of interest. And just to highlight that point, so this is the CPI, the index itself, over a 75-year time period. It's pretty boring. Kind of looks like my 5-year-old's drawing a line on a blank piece of paper. So just a bit of a diagonal line. You can see some periods where it's gone up a bit quicker, say through the 1970s and more recently just at the end there. But the index on its own doesn't really tell you much. So what is of interest is the rate of change in that index. So this is a chart that will be coming out tomorrow, as I mentioned, with some of the material we're publishing. So this is the annual change of CPI over 75 years, or starting from 1949. And yeah, this shows a really interesting history of Australia's economic history, starting with the Korean War boom, where we saw inflation of around 24% in annual terms in the early 1950s. You can see that in the 1970s, there was high inflation for most of that decade, with things like the OPEC oil price shock, the recession in the early 90s, the impact the introduction of GST had on the CPI in 2000. You can see there things like the global financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, what that did for inflation, and more recently the highest inflation we've seen in 30 years. So when you look at the rate of change of the CPI, it does tell a really interesting story of Australia's economic history. And that green bar you can see is the inflation targeting of the RBA. That's been going for 30 years now. And you can see over that time when CPI has been above or below that target or within that target. All right, I might just pause there. That's kind of the first part. Was there any questions, Aidan, or did anyone want to just unmute and ask a question at this stage?
I will note that we don't have anything in the chat. So yes, if anyone does have a question, please feel free to unmute and ask away, or pop it in the chat and we can get to it later.
All right, let's keep going. So thought I'd spend a bit of time just going through some of the additional outputs that the ABS produces to I guess, complement the CPI, and just to talk through kind of what those means and perhaps how to interpret them. But in terms of what's available, there's a lot more than just the CPI, one number. So the ABS, we split the CPI into 11 fairly broad groups of categories of spending. So things like food, alcohol, tobacco, clothing, housing, health, expenditure. So there's 11 of these categories. And then we split those further into what we call expenditure classes. There's 87 of those. And this is the lowest level that we publish CPI data for. So price change for 87 expenditure classes. What you can see in the image here is if you think of the CPI as a pyramid, with the CPI up the top, we've got groups just below it. We have expenditure classes, so those 87 categories I mentioned. Below that, we split the expenditure classes into even more detailed categories. There's, I think, a little bit less than 1,000 of those. And then within those quite detailed categories is where we have our samples, so where we collect the prices. So yeah, just to sort of give a sense of how the CPI is constructed from I guess, a bottom-up approach. And what we publish is data for each capital city, so the 8 capital cities, plus a weighted average of those capital cities, which we refer to as the national or Australia figure. We also have our data in original and seasonally adjusted terms. For the CPI, the headline figure is in original terms, and one reason for that is for the seasonally adjusted outputs, they can get revised. The CPI itself isn't particularly seasonal. The categories below that can be quite seasonal in terms of price change. If you think of fruit or travel with school holidays, holiday travel, you can see a lot of seasonality in those categories. But at the CPI level, it's not particularly seasonal. But we focus on the original data because it doesn't get revised. And when the CPI is linked to, as I mentioned earlier, linked to a number of payments or a number of contracts, if we were to revise that figure, that could cause our users a lot of, I suppose, issues. So that's where we our headline being the original series of the CPI. But we have season adjusted data for, I guess, analytical purposes. And just next is some analytical measures. So we don't just produce the CPI, we produce a suite of measures, which I'll spend a bit more time on shortly explaining. And the ABS, there is more than just the consumer price index available. We do, so that the branch I work in also produces the wage price index, which is a fairly high profile measure of wage inflation. We also have the producer price index, so this is more your business inflation. This is a major input into measures of GDP that I talked about. And the international trade price index also is used in GDP, but you can also think of it or look at it in terms of our terms of trade, so the prices we receive for our exports and imports. Okay, so I thought it'd be useful just to spend a bit of time on some of the other measures that we produce in addition to the CPI. And there's, I guess, 3 types that we produce. I've sort of divided them into 3 different types of measures. The first is where we split the 87 expenditure classes into 2 categories. So instead of having 1 CPI basket, you've got 2. And we do that based on a kind of a thematic approach. And I've got a couple of examples of why we do that and why it's interesting. The second type is where you remove certain impacts from the headline CPI figure, that impacts that might be either a one-off or volatile in nature. You remove those impacts from the CPI just to give a better sense of maybe what the underlying or trend of CPI is. And the third is our living cost indexes. So these come out 1 week after the CPI. And I'll just talk a little bit about how we produce those and explain what they are. Okay, so just in terms of splitting the CPI 87 categories into 2 different or 2 separate categories. So one of the ways we do this is through goods and services. So fairly obvious the things we categorise as goods. So food, alcohol and tobacco, motor vehicles, petrol, we all classify as a good, and that represents a bit over half the CPI. So 55% of the CPI is we classify as a good. Services, on the other hand, are things like restaurant meals, rents, education. So again, fairly obvious, and that represents about 45% of the CPI basket. Now, this has been, particularly services, has been a topic of interest recently. So services inflation can be more sticky in nature. And if we just move on to the chart here, so this is looking at the annual movement in the goods category, so the blue line, and the services category being the red line. So I'll just focus on the sort of endpoint here. So this is kind of post-COVID the CPI inflation. So when the CPI started to increase, it was really driven by goods inflation. So that the blue line picked up quite quickly. One of the reasons being, with more people staying at home and working from home, there was strong demand for things like furniture, office equipment, your audio visual equipment. People really wanted to furnish their home, so strong demand, and that was coupled with some of the supply issues that were happening at the same time. So shipping costs increased dramatically. There was factories closing down overseas because of COVID restrictions. So the supply and demand was thrown out of whack, and we saw prices increase for goods quite quickly in that time, along with things like petrol being another example. Also, house construction, which is included in the CPI, dwelling costs, dwelling construction costs, that's classified as in the goods category. What we've seen in 2023 is goods inflation start to ease. So that's prices. Prices are still going up, but they're not going up as much as they were. And we've seen services inflation start to climb over the last 12 months. So things like rents have gone up quite a bit, as has insurance. So there's sort of two main categories, but we're also, we heard the RBA governor talk about categories like dentists and hairdressers. We have seen price increases for those categories more than we have in previous years. It's probably worth pointing out that pre-COVID, that there was that dip in, or just as the COVID pandemic occurred, there was that large dip in services inflation. That was due to free childcare. We had free childcare for a short period, so that can sort of show what things like a short-term impact can have on some of these series. So yeah, the services inflation is something that's being watched quite closely, that the ABS has produced along with the CPI. Another way we split the CPI into two categories is this idea of discretionary spending and non-discretionary spending. So non-discretionary we define as things that are unavoidable. If price changes, if prices go up, their inflation, that's the sort of spending that can't be avoided. So inelastic in nature, for an economic term. So obvious things like food, petrol. If the price of petrol goes up and you're driving a car, you've just got to sort of cop that. So that's about 60% of the CPI. Discretionary spending is around 40%. So things like, clothing. Yes, everyone needs clothing, but people don't need new clothing. They can maybe hold off spending on things like new clothing or new furniture. Restaurants, instead of going out to a restaurant, you can eat at home. So things where you can substitute away from, we consider discretionary. And holiday travel, of course, you don't need to go on a holiday if prices for those things go up. So yeah, this is an interesting split in terms of thinking about maybe the cost of living. So non-discretionary things that we purchase that are unavoidable if prices go up. So that can sort of feed into a discussion around cost of living pressures. And again, this compares the annual movement between these two categories. So with non-discretionary inflation, this increased a lot faster than discretionary inflation post-COVID. So things like petrol was a main one there, as was dwelling construction. So people shelter being a non-discretionary item. Those really drove that series in the early stages, and it has started to ease in recent quarters or in 2023, but still very high. Prior to, or again, with the onset of COVID-19, with free childcare and petrol prices falling to about $1 a litre in some cases, we saw that the non-discretionary series actually be negative for a couple of quarters in annual terms. So it can show that how some of these temporary impacts do sort of flow through to these series. So that's I guess the first way we kind of split up the CPI to give it a different, I suppose, just a different insight into inflation and what the causes are. Something that we also do is we want to remove some of the temporary or one-off impacts that so I refer to free childcare, these sorts of things. The CPI itself can be quite volatile in terms of the quarterly movement. So by removing any one-off impacts, you're creating a smoother series. So one way to think about this is, what is the underlying inflation, or what is the trend of inflation, and that's the main purpose of I guess removing these impacts. So the measures we have in this case, that they remove, so petrol can be quite volatile in prices, as we know. So if you take out petrol, that means these measures are a bit more stable, and even temporary or one-off shocks. So free childcare, again, as an example, where we do that, or where it takes care of that. It does produce a smoother series, which can be helpful for policymakers and economists, just in terms of understanding, the pace or nature of inflation, and does kind of complement the CPI. And there's two ways we do this. So we can exclude the same thing each time. This is done by many countries. So I think in the US they have the CPI excluding food and energy. They do that every month or every quarter. So the ABS, we do that as well. But we also have a measure called the trim mean and weighted median, where we exclude different things every quarter, and I'll talk about that shortly. Just another example of where these measures have been useful. So for those of us who've been around a while, you might remember 2006, we had Cyclone Larry wiping out a lot of the banana crops. Banana prices shot up 400%. What that meant is that people stopped purchasing bananas because they were too expensive. But the way we measured the CPI was that we had to assume that people kept buying bananas in the same volume, and that actually did have a noticeable impact on the CPI, the headline CPI figure, when those prices increased. By having these measures that remove the impact of bananas in this case, we can sort of see through those effects on the CPI. Bananas is a good example because we do a lot better job of removing that from the CPI itself now through the data that we use. But I won't go into that. All right, so just very quickly, how we measure the trim mean. So this is just a diagram just to help illustrate that. So we take the 87 categories of the CPI, the quarterly movements. We use the seasonally adjusted movement for the trim mean. So we line those quarterly movements up from the lowest movement, often it's negative, to the highest quarterly movement. So we rank them in that order, and then we take the bottom 15% and kind of throw that away, and the top 15% and throw that away, and take the average of the middle 70% of CPI categories. So yeah, it gives a sense of the distribution of the CPI inflation, removes those I guess outliers or large or extreme quarterly movements that are generally either temporary or one-off impact. And by taking the average of the middle 70%, we get a better sense of the underlying measure of inflation. So the trim mean is the average of the middle 70%. The weighted median is another measure that we produce, which is similar in nature, and it's measured in a similar way, except we just simply take the middle category, so the 50th percentile. The trim mean is typically looked at more closely than the weighted median. So we tend to sort of focus on the trim mean in our media release and commentary. They do tend to track fairly closely the trim mean weighted median, but yeah, the RBA and others feel that the trim mean's a slightly better indicator of underlying inflation. So, but we do produce both, but focus on the trim mean. So this is comparing, again, these are the quarterly movements. So the CPI is the blue line. You can see it is a little bit volatile, particularly during the COVID period. So where we had things like free childcare and fuel, we saw deflation for one quarter. And then when free childcare came off and fuel prices rose, it shot back up. So the weighted median and trim mean, the green and red lines, you can see remove those impacts and had a lot smoother series. So I was able to, I suppose, take care of those extreme movements and provide a better sense of the quarterly movement of inflation. Yep. And just finally with this part, the living cost indexes. So we produce so the CPI is an average for all households. What we do with the living cost indexes is provide measures of living costs for 4 different types of households. So employee households, age pensioner, other government recipients and self-funded retirees. So it's based on the main source of income for those households. So we can get a sense of how inflation's the impact inflation's is for different types of households. So it's useful just to understand how inflation affects households differently. So what we do is we take the price information from the CPI. So we use the same data from the CPI, and we apply that to a different basket for each household. And what I mean by that is a different set of weights for each household. So if you think about employee households, they're going to have childcare in their basket, whereas age pensioners won't. Self-funded retirees have a lot higher weight on holiday travel. They travel a lot more than other government recipients. So by having these different weights applied to the CPI price data, we get different quarterly movements for these households. So yeah, it's quite a simple thing to produce if you have that weighting information for each household. And just a final point on this, so the CPI is not a measure of cost of living. Its purpose is a measure of inflation. The living costs are the closest thing that the APS produces to a cost of living index. It's not quite a cost of living measure, but it's the closest thing that there is. So I guess if you're discussing cost of living, the living cost index is one to sort of look at. So I said earlier that the index isn't particularly interesting. I've plotted the index numbers for each of the households in the CPI over about a 10-year period, just to show that they're very similar. So the CPI is in there somewhere in the middle, and the other households are grouped pretty closely around that. You do see some differences on a quarterly basis in terms of the movements, but over a long period of time, they track each other pretty closely. The exception is employee households. And the reason for this is employee households have a lot larger weight on housing in their basket. And the way we measure housing in the living costs is mortgage interest charges. I'll get onto that in the next slide. So in the early part of this slide, interest rates were falling. So the living costs for employee households were going up by less than the other households. In more recent times, though, with interest rates rising, we can see that employee households has caught up, almost caught up to the other households in quite a short period of time. So again, shows how different things can impact the households based on the different baskets in there. All right, so this is, I guess, an important, I suppose, topic in the CPI. So how do we measure housing? So the CPI being a measure of inflation, we have dwelling construction costs in the CPI as our measure for housing. Prior to the 1997 review, we did have mortgage interest charges in the CPI, and switched to dwelling construction costs to more closely align it to a measure of inflation. We recognised that there was still a lot of interest in how mortgage interest rates affect households and their living costs. So since the late 90s, we've also produced these living cost measures. So the main differences between the CPI and the living costs is the way we measure housing. So we don't have interest rates in the CPI, we do have them in the living costs. So in addition to the different weighting, different baskets, the way we measure housing is the biggest difference between the CPI and the living costs. And as I mentioned, other countries measure housing differently in their CPI, or not at all in some cases. And just to give you a sense of, so again, this is the index number. So the blue line is how housing is measured in the CPI. The red line is in the living cost index. So you can see for dwelling construction costs, they tend to rise fairly slowly for the most part, and then jumped up quite quickly just after COVID, when construction costs really rose quite fast. Interest rates, on the other hand, were quite, well, they fell initially at the start of this period, and then fell a bit more just prior to COVID. And since the RBA has started raising rates, it's jumped up very quickly. So the red line tends to track the RBA cash rate quite closely, and that's what's used in the living cost measures. All right, again, I'll just pause there for any questions, Aidan, or if anyone wants to unmute before moving on to the last part.
Still nothing in the chat as of yet.
Yep.
Again, inviting others to unmute in this moment just now. I will note if people do have questions after the presentation, they can, of course, always send them through the media team. But for now, thank you very much, Leigh. If anyone does want to ask a question, please don't hesitate, but in a moment, we'll continue.
Okay, so just spend a little bit of time on how the CPI is measured. So there's two, I suppose, components to the CPI. There's the price information that we collect every month, every quarter, and also the basket, the information contained in the CPI basket. So where do we get the basket, CPI basket information from? That's the ABS has a household expenditure survey. It's run every 5 or 6 years. It's actually been 2016 was the last time we had this information, so it's been a little while since we've had a household expenditure survey. And the way we use that information is to determine what goes into the CPI basket, so the types of goods and services that we measure, and also how much of goes into that basket. So the CPI basket's based on expenditure. So if households spend more on, say, petrol has a higher weight in the CPI than milk. So we spend more on petrol than we do milk. So while we both include both in the basket, petrol has a higher weight compared to milk, and the information, where we get that information, is from the household expenditure survey. So the ABS recognises that spending can change, it changes all the time, and every 6 years updating the basket is too infrequent. So for the last kind of 5 or 6 years, we've been updating the weights in the basket every year, and we use that using fairly aggregate data from the national accounts, and this does a good job of picking up some of the major changes from year to year, and I'll give an example of that shortly. Why is this important? So by updating the weights in the CPI basket, it actually reduces what's an upward bias in the CPI. So a lot of people think that the CPI is often too low. In fact, you could argue that, well, there is an upward bias in some cases, and by updating the weights in the CPI, we're trying to reduce that bias, and I'll explain that on the next slide. And we also want to make sure that the CPI basket represents contemporary, up-to-date household spending. And the point I made earlier is that the basket represents average household spending across all households. So we're not targeting a particular type of household for the CPI, that is, living cost indexes we do, but we're looking at the average spending across all Australian households. Okay, so substitution bias. So it's really important that we update the weights in the CPI basket to reduce this phenomenon known as substitution bias. So I'll just give a hypothetical example of what that is. So if the price of beef goes up, what do consumers do? They switch to chicken. So that's a rational response that we know occurs. They purchase less beef, switch to chicken. It's a good substitute, and it's cheaper. Its prices haven't risen as much. If we don't update the weights in the CPI, it means we have a too high a weight for beef. It's overrepresented in the CPI. We're not capturing that recent shift in consumption. So what that means is the price change for beef is overrepresented in the CPI. So that's what pushes up the CPI. That's the sort of upward bias I mentioned. So we've got too high a weight for beef because households are purchasing less of it, and beef prices are going up faster than chicken. So by updating the CPI basket each year, what we can do is reduce the weight for beef, so it's more closely aligned to how much households are spending on beef, and increase the weight for chicken, and that reduces that upward bias in this example. So there's lots of these types of examples, and yeah, this substitution bias is something that many countries look at quite closely. And just to give you an example of why updating the weights each year is really important. So with the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that spending changed really quickly and in a big way. And if we hadn't updated the weights on an annual basis, we would have been stuck with an out-of-date basket in the CPI for longer than would have been ideal. So one of the biggest changes we saw during COVID was international travel. That typically has a weight of around 3.5% in the CPI, so quite a big weight. So households spend about 3.5% on international travel on average in terms of total spending. This pretty much fell to zero. You just couldn't travel. So we had to update the basket in the CPI to reduce the weight for travel and increase the weight for other things. So this is a chart of from our retail trade outputs. So normally spending, so the first part of the chart on the left shows that spending normally goes up sort of in line with each other. So these are the different spending categories. We've got food and clothing and cafes and restaurants. So normally updating the CPI basket doesn't lead to a lot of change, but when COVID hit, we saw spending patterns just take an absolute significant change. So things like cafes and restaurants fell, that orange line, so did clothing. But then we saw food spending increase, so more people at home, they're spending more on food. So the ABS was able to quickly respond and update the CPI basket to reflect these changes, during lockdowns and now coming out of COVID as well. We're updating the basket each year. And this is how the weights themselves changed across the different CPI categories. So you can see food in 2019, so the red bar, the weight for food increased from sort of 17% to around 18-19%. It doesn't sound like a big increase, but when it comes to its impact on the CPI, it can have a material effect. The other notable change was recreation and culture. So this includes a lot of things, but travel being a big one. You can see its weight in 2019 was about 13%. It fell to about 8% with both international and domestic holiday travel falling when borders were closed and these things. So by updating the basket, we're able to have a more accurate CPI during the COVID-19 kind of experience. And now that we're sort of getting back to normal, we've got the weights returning to sort of pre-COVID levels. It's also interesting to look at how the CPI basket, the weights have changed over decades, and we've got some information on this coming out tomorrow. But you can see in 1960, the weight for food in the CPI was nearly 1/3, and in 2018, it was half that. So this doesn't mean we're spending less on food. It means as a proportion of our total spending, it's now around 16% on average, whereas in 1960, about 1/3 of our total spending was on food. So yeah, just want to be clear, we're not saying we're eating less and spending less on food. It's we're actually spending less as a proportion of total spending. So it's interesting to look down the different categories, how our spending has changed over the decades. So housing spending has gone up as a total proportion. So spending more on things like rents, utilities, owning your own home, and recreation and culture was 3% in 1960. It's now nearly 13%. So that's comparing to 2018. We've got the 2023 comparison coming out tomorrow. So yeah, just interesting to see how with things like having higher incomes, having two income households, cheaper imports. Imports are a lot cheaper now than they were in the 1960s. How that's impacted or changed our spending over this period. One thing that's interesting to note is so the price information that we use in the CPI, we use a range of different data sources. So going back 10 years, we used to send out a lot of ABS collectors into supermarkets, into stores, to collect the prices and enter them into our handheld devices. We pretty much did that for all of the CPI. Now it's only about half the CPI, and all of that is office-based. So we get the prices from websites or calling businesses. So that's about half the CPI now. What we make use of to replace that is what we call administrative data. So administrative data is either collected by governments or businesses for other purposes that we can actually make use of for official statistics. So a really good example is we now use scanner data, which we obtain from supermarkets. So every time your items get scanned, we get access to that information, and that includes things like the how much is spent and how much is purchased. We don't get information on the individuals. It's simply how much what's being purchased in those supermarkets. So that information covers about 17%, 16% of the CPI. And I mentioned that bananas earlier. Now that we have spending information on bananas on a monthly basis, we can actually, if there's another cyclone that has a similar impact as 2006, we can treat or remove that impact from the CPI with that spending information. More recently, we've made use of web scraped information. So this is where we have some software that scrapes prices from retailers' websites automatically. So we can do that on a sort of weekly basis and collect a lot of information in that way. We do only use it for a small amount of the CPI, so alcohol and clothing, a couple of examples, but there's a lot of potential there that the ABS is reviewing and other countries are too. And we also have other administrative data. So for things like rents or electricity, we can get access to these different data sources, which are collected kind of digitally, and we get access to them. So it's a lot more efficient way to collect our price information, and we can collect a lot more of it than we used to previously. So it just means a more accurate CPI. And finally, this is my last slide. Just very quickly on quality change. Quality change is a very broad and complex topic, which I won't go into, but when you think about things like smartphones and high-tech goods, we have to take into account the quality change and when it comes to measuring the CPI. But I thought I'd mention something that's discussed quite a bit is this idea of shrinkflation, how we capture that in the CPI. So shrinkflation is a form of quality change where the packet size is reduced, but often the price doesn't change. So in this hypothetical example, we've got a 750 ml drink in period 1. The price in each period, so each month, let's say, is $3. It doesn't change. But what we observe in period 3 is its volume, or the packet size, has decreased 10% to 675 mils. So in the CPI, if we just collected the price, we would show no price change. By collecting the packet size information, we actually show that shrinkflation, that fall of 10%, we show that as a price rise of 10%. So we are picking up these sorts of things in the CPI where this is happening, and it is quite common, as you can imagine, in a lot of kind of food and grocery items. So that is something that we pay close attention to and make sure that it does get captured in the CPI. Otherwise, yeah, you'd be showing no price change in that example. All right, that was everything. Yeah, happy to take questions. I think we've got a little bit of time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Leigh. We've got a couple of questions in the chat that have come through. The first one is quite relevant to that last slide. How long has the ABS been measuring quality change for?
Well, forever. Well, so yeah, it's always been part of the thinking, and the way we measure quality change has changed over the years, and what we need to pick up. There's an interesting piece of machinery in the building here, which we no longer use, but just to give an example, I don't know when it was, perhaps back in the 50s or 60s, we used to test the strength of clothing with this machine, which would test the strength of the fabric, and there would be a quality adjustment based on that. So just to give an example, we've always tried to capture quality change. We don't do that for clothing anymore. The things we tend to focus on are these high-tech goods where smartphones are continually being upgraded. You've also got new products which you need to incorporate into the CPI. So we do that on a regular basis. So we do have smartphones, smartwatches, streaming services, electric vehicles, these sorts of things. And a lot of effort goes into making sure we're capturing quality change to pick it up as best we can in the CPI. It is very difficult. We probably don't get it right all the time. But yeah, we do spend a lot of effort in making sure it's as we capture it as best as possible. So yeah, we've always captured quality change in some form. Shrinkflation is something that I think I've been in the CPI for 15 years. We've always looked at shrinkflation as something that's been around for quite a while, and something quite important to pick up. So yeah, I think to answer your question, we've always looked at quality change and adjusted for it in the CPI.
Thank you, Leigh. We've got a couple more questions, and I'm going to try and get through all of them. The first one is a fantastic question from Ricardo at SBS. Is there anything that we can do as journos to improve our reporting on CPI, or is there something that we do that infuriates you?
I think so it doesn't infuriate me, but the CPI does get conflated with cost of living, and I can understand why. It's a good sort of proxy, but yeah, the CPI it's not measured for the purposes of cost of living. So I think that there needs to be a little bit more nuance around that. Maybe it's a little bit too sort of abstract or academic, but we do often have to remind journalists and others that the CPI isn't a cost of living measure, even though it gets sort of looked at like that. The living cost measures, which I spend a bit of time on, is something else to pay attention to with that. So yeah, I think just thinking about what cost of living is and what the CPI is, yeah, just requires a little bit of nuance. Something that is often reported, I suppose incorrectly, is that the CPI doesn't include housing in its basket. It does include housing, but not the way perhaps a lot of people think. So it doesn't include mortgage interest charges, as I mentioned. We include it in the form of dwelling construction costs. And housing is a very difficult topic when it comes to the CPI. There is no international consensus. It's very contested. The ABS's method is, I think the international consensus is moving towards the way the ABS has done it for, I think since the late 90s. Yeah. So, but to actually do it in practice, a lot of countries find that difficult. Yeah. So yeah, housing is one that often gets, I suppose, overlooked in terms of it is in the CPI, just it's in there in a different way than what perhaps people think it should be.
Yeah, thank you. Building on that topic, we've got a question here from Inga Ting at the ABC. What is the ABS's CPI index not so good at measuring compared to other countries, for example?
Okay. I won't say not as good as measuring, but housing is one where it does differ. And we put out an article a couple of months ago that just explains why and why that there are different approaches. I will say the ABS is one of the world leaders in its use of scanner data. We're lucky that we do get access to a lot of scanner data, and the methods we've used to incorporate that are quite sophisticated. You know, you want to make use of automated approaches because there's so much data you can't simply use outdated techniques. So a lot of work went in about a bit over 5 years ago to make the best use possible of the scanner data. Also, web scraping is another one that a lot of countries are looking at. Maybe one thing where we are a bit behind, well, two things actually. CPI is quarterly in Australia, so we're one of only 2 OECD countries where, the other being New Zealand, where the CPI is measured quarterly. We do have a monthly indicator for the last 12 months, and we recently received some funding from the budget earlier this year to transition towards a full monthly CPI by the end of 2025. So we are on a pathway to a full monthly CPI, which will bring us into line with most other countries. The final one was the household expenditure survey that is run quite infrequently in Australia. Other countries do it a bit more frequently.
Thank you. The point there about the difference between quarterly and monthly CPI measures feeds into our final question from Peter. Is there much of a quality difference between quarterly and monthly CPI measures?
So right now there is. So the monthly indicator, and we've been quite clear on this. So it is an indicator of the quarterly CPI. It uses the same data. On a monthly basis. It's just we don't measure the full CPI basket every month. It's about kind of 70% of the CPI basket we measure on a monthly basis, and over a 3-month period, it becomes 100% of that basket. So that's where we have suggested to users to focus on the quarterly CPI as the main measure of inflation, and the monthly indicator gives you an early read of what inflation. So what's coming out tomorrow gives an earlier indicator of what the quarterly CPI will be when it comes out early next year. That being said, 2025 we aim to have a monthly CPI which measures the full basket on a monthly basis, and will essentially replace the quarterly CPI because it'll be of similar or better quality than the quarterly CPI. We still will have the quarterly data available just because it's a long time series, but the monthly CPI will replace will become the sort of headline CPI figure.
Thank you, Leigh. Look, we're about to hit the end of our meeting. If you do have any further questions, please don't hesitate to send them to the ABS media team. Just if you've got a pen and paper there, or you can type something up, media@abs.gov.au. But otherwise, thank you everyone for attending, for taking the time to come and learn a bit more or refresh your knowledge. And we hope to continue to work with you all as time continues.